this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for showing up, and good evening to Amandeep. I think you're the only sole person who's not in our time zone. But so thank you for joining, so late in the evening. And thank you to GCP, International Student Center, and the Sociology Department for sponsoring this event. It's something that have been on my mind for some time, actually, and I'm trying to, finally we got a space to do this. And the reason for scheduling the program today is because the violence that was unleashed on Sikhs between October 31 and November 4th. That's the week, and hence the reason for doing it today. Now, my memory from 1984 has actually shifted over time. I was a ninth grader in 1984 in Calcutta, India, which is on the east coast of the country. And I remember the October 31 to November 4, but not the events that preceded. And there's, I think, a reason for that. In October 31, after the prime minister was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards, there was violence unleashed. And as with minorities that happen, one person does something, the whole group is implicated in that process. And for me, in the Indian context, by the virtue of being born into Hindu and upper caste, I am part of the majority group there, so which is equivalent to being white in the United States. So when I walk into a classroom or elsewhere, people don't realize that I occupy this shifting position between majority minority, between two societies. So I draw for my experiential insights, if you will, when talking about race, which is my area of focus in the United States. And so the narrative that I was familiar with and was aligned with, actually, at the time as well as a ninth grader, was of the Sikh terrorist. And, the word terrorist carries a lot of power. Historically, who gets to define it, who gets to define whom as a terrorist is important to kind of think about. And the label, the way we apply it today, is not how historically it has been used. But at the time, as I said, I was aligned with the dominant perspective because, nothing before October 31 really affected me. My prime minister was assassinated, right? And I was sad as a result of that. And just like any majority group member, I also had many blind spots. But since then, my understanding of it has evolved. I came to this country in 1986 in high school. And interestingly, I came to Queens, New York, and that's also when a majority of the Sikh immigrants whom I later study entered the city, and our reasons for leaving India were quite different. Mine was, I wasn't studying, so my parents sent me away to my aunts in Queens. And for the cabbies who were starting to enter the industry at the time, part of the reason was the persecution being experienced in Punjab, the state repression of Sikhs in Punjab. And today I focus on Sikh immigrants and understanding the experience of what it means to be an immigrant in the society. And so so reflecting back, that intersection that both of us came to this country, but for different reasons, and how my understanding of what had happened in 1984 has changed over time. As I came to adulthood in America, and my intellectual consciousness also evolved in America. And so in some sense, my memory of 1984 is also a diasporic memory of sorts. At least that's how I see it, right? And so in that context, to discuss this and how we memorialize and how it's impacted by various things and different contexts, I thought of Shruti and Amandeep, two people whose work I value and respect a lot and have been following for some time now. So here they are today. So thanks to them again. So with that little brief introduction, I want to sort of start the questions. I don't know if either one of you would like to place yourselves in 1984, but certainly if we could start with the specific events that happened between October 31 and November 4, like that week, so that all of us know the micro details of that. So either one of you would like to get us thinking about that.
Do you want me to start? Great. Thank you so much, Diditi, Ashley, Janice, and everyone else. Thanks so much for organizing this event, and thanks everyone else for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening. So I think Diditi started, or should I call you Dr. Mitra? Is it okay to call you?
No, doctor, please. No, doctor, no, professor. Diditi is just fine. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm just so used to calling you Diditi that I'm continuing with that. But I mean, so implied in that, implicit, underlining that is, the honorific Dr. Mitra, Professor Mitra. But I think you started on this interesting idea of situating yourself, but also just the malleability of or changeability of memory and the dominant narrative. I'll just quickly talk about this is a very complex set of events. It's, of course, the Indian state would like to portray it as a very simplistic kind of thing, that Sikhs were terrorists, like you said, and they invited this violence that happened during October 31st and November 4th, has a long history. It's a violence that happened during these days. So this is the 39th year anniversary. And then it carried on in other shapes and forms later, especially in Punjab with what's known as the decade of disappearances. So just very briefly, the immediate precursor for the violence that happened during these days, what we are commemorating today, is, like Diditi said, the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards. But just before that, it was because the Golden Temple was invaded, the Golden Temple, or the Darbar Sahib or Harmandir Sahib, however you might want to call it. These are different terms for the same shrine, which is one of the holiest shrines of Sikhs. In my work, based on what some other scholars have written, I refer to it as the theopolitical center of Sikhs. It's the theological center of Sikhs, but also there isn't a simplistic distinction between religion, theology, and politics in Sikh religion, just like in many other, perhaps, or at least some other non-Western faiths. So the Golden Temple is the theopolitical center of Sikhs. It's in the northwest Indian state of India, Punjab, in Amritsar. The Indian army, following many political tensions between many different actors, the Indian army invaded the shrine. There were pilgrims there, thousands of pilgrims who were there to mark the martyrdom of one of the gurus or teachers or founders of the Sikh faith. So there was a lot of, loss of lives, maybe at least 10,000 people, even more, but just the desecration of the shrine. And in some ways, it's sort of an embodiment of the collective body of the community spirit. So that happened in June, and there were other developments that happened after that. And then there was a lot of outrage. There was a lot of sadness. There was a lot of anger, suffering. And that got manifested through the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi on the evening of October 31st, 1984. There is some evidence based on the work that civil rights organizations have done, journalists, academics, etc., have done, that the Sikh community was going to be targeted at some point anyway in New Delhi and other parts of India. And then this assassination became this very kind of convenient excuse to target and stigmatize the community. So Sikh houses were marked, vehicles were identified. There was what some people have called ritualistic killings that happened, where Sikhs were dragged out of their houses. Sikh men, not all of them, but many of them wear their hair long, tied in a turban, and hair is referred to as case in Punjabi. And so case was shown, there were ties put around their necks. So I'm sorry, I don't want to go into gory details, but it was a very gruesome, brutal violence against the community. And just like with any other violence, it was the people who were most marginalized in terms of class and caste that suffered the most. And one of the reasons for the disconnect, which I found in my research, the disconnect between Sikhs at large and the Sikhs who suffered the violence, at least some people in the diaspora talked about how they had bought into this dominant narrative of Sikhs being killed because Prime Minister Gandhi was assassinated by his Sikh bodyguards, and of course the Sikhs had to be taught a lesson. At the time there were also like mass media was used, so there were slogans for like khoon ka badla khoon, which means blood for blood, so revenge, right? That, oh, we need to take revenge for this, when it was actually a much more complicated issue. But Sikhs kind of, at least some Sikhs, bought into that narrative as well. And it wasn't until later, and moving away from India and questioning and challenging those narratives, that they were able to see it in a more nuanced light. So I know I'm a little bit all over, but so it was mostly lower caste, lower class Sikhs. Women suffered in, just like in any other violence, women's bodies became sites of violence. They were gang raped. There isn't a lot of, there is some work on this, but not a lot, because, it's just something that's very difficult to talk about. And a lot of this work is a work of, it's the social process of representing this violence as traumatic. So it's not just, just like the Holocaust, it's not like the Holocaust happened and then the Holocaust consciousness automatically came about. There is a social process of construction, representing, meaning making, that's going into constructing 1984 as traumatic, as violent, as a genocide. And I feel like this discussion that we are having contributes to that kind of construction and representation and meaning making that's happening within the community, but perhaps now also in other spaces. I'm not Sikh myself, and I don't want to take too much more time and go into the story of how I started working on it. But if during Q&A, if that comes up, I can say more. But Amandeep, I know it was very scattered. So some other things that you want to add to that, please, would be great.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in terms of, you said that class and caste were critical, right? And a follow up on that, and this is mostly because most of the cabbies that I spoke with in New York, they were of rural backgrounds, and the narratives of 1984 do come up in that as well, talking about the violence that was unleashed and family members murdered. So I'm wondering how the impact was, whether it was different for the rural versus the urban Sikhs in Punjab, if either one of you can comment on that.
Maybe I'll let Amandeep address it, because I already talked a lot. If there's anything else that you'd like me to kind of clarify or say later, I can do that. But I don't want to take up all the space. So Amandeep, please go ahead. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Hello, everybody, and I must apologize right in the beginning. It's not only I'm geographically away, our time zone is away. I wish I were in a city which had less air pollution, because I'm in Delhi right now. I'm researching my book, and the AQI levels are 500 to 999, and it's terribly bad, and I've got a chest congestion and all that. I might cough in between. Please pardon me. Diviti, your question can come in a little later, I think, because you guys might have to go and do some reading on your own, and we could point you to things that you could read. But there are three aspects of 1984 which I think need to be highlighted. One is the violence of it, the sheer violence of it, because many journalists have now held that white phosphorus kind of material was used, that, of course, kerosene and petrol were used, to tires were put around eggs, burnt, and women were raped, and all that has happened. So the gruesome nature of the violence is one aspect. But if you look at it, 1984 has become a sort of template for the Indian state. Because what happened in Godhra in 2002 was actually the 1984 set the template for that. And this is a template of impunity, that you can go and commit gory violence against a community and nothing will happen. So now Indian Parliament in the last few years, there was a statement by the BJP government itself that about 442 cases have reached completion. People have been punished. Many more cases are in the offing right now. But none of the big leaders, these are mobs, these are people who were just brought in, they were given cash incentives to do this. They were given liquor to do this. But none of the masterminds of the violence has ever been prosecuted, except one who is in jail. Another case against him came up and he's denying it. There were a couple who are dead now. It's been 39 years. But I also see another aspect of it, traveling India. And I would want to bring that up here because I think we must acknowledge it. That this violence that happened mostly happened in the states, Delhi, in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar. If you look up the Indian map, it's like in the Ganga belt, you know. In South India, where I live, our chief minister did not allow violence to happen in Karnataka. In Andhra Pradesh, the then chief minister prevented violence. I mean, there were one or two incidents, in fact, and they were quickly curbed down. In Tamil Nadu, for example, another state, deep south, these were opposition-run states. So these people had, of course, Indira Gandhi was a rival for them. They were sad that a leader has been assassinated, but they were not Congress governments. So they took an interest in saving people. In Maharashtra, something iffy happened. Most likely blood money happened. The Sikhs paid off. But even two Congress states, for example, Rajasthan and Assam at that time, and do look at the map of India to get a sense of what I'm saying. Violence, Congress did not allow violence to happen. In Bengal, of course, Viditi said that violence broke out for a few hours and then the chief minister landed and he immediately stopped it. So when we talk of 1984, at one level in certain parts of India, it has been brazen mob violence. But at other parts of India, and we need to start talking about this also. Because now when I travel for this book about Sikhs who live in India, outside Punjab, I'm getting testimonies of 84. And I have so many people telling me how their Hindu neighbors saved them, how their Christian churches saved them. This also needs to come into our discourse. See, our job as historians and as researchers is to nuance what happened. Absolutely, we must not forget or even and get punished the perpetuators of the violence. But we must credit people also by standing by the community. Even in Delhi, the violence was uneven. As Shruti just said, the killings happened in the poorer colonies of Sikhs. And most of these Sikhs, they were mostly from North Rajasthan, a state in India, which is next to Delhi. They were artisanal class people. And they had already come to India during partition of India in 1947. So they were double refugees. In fact, triple, because in one of the colonies was a resettlement colony of them. That is where the Trilokpuri, which is where 800 people were killed according to unofficial sources. Officials hold it at 350. One afternoon. Well, I think we need to expand our lens on how we look at the violence. The third point I'm making is I am beginning to admire the tenacity of the community, that whether it is within India or it is outside India, it has been asking for justice. There are two different reasons that drive it. But there is something to the community, and this tenacity we saw even during the 2 years back when we had the farmers' protest, they stood for 15 months and they said, no, repeal the laws. Now, there are other violences that have happened. Official numbers might be a little less than what Sikhs went through. But I see other reasons why the ones fighting for justice for them have tired out. The system has tired them out. Imagine 40 years of struggling. And this will go on. No, I see one Sikh gentleman here. I see another Sikh surname here. Like these, it will go on. It will go on for 100 years. So today, somebody, a writer who has written about what prime ministers, how they think and all, she said, "Oh, it is somebody who was behind it." And she said, "I hope that at some point it is peace returns." But how? By forgetting? No. And this tenacity, I would like to add here, is the belief of these citizens of the country, not outside, but within the country, of these citizens in the Constitution of India. That the Constitution says we will give you justice. So why isn't justice being done? Under the current regime, how human rights activists, how lawyers and all are, we know that story. Some of you might be aware. I was just interviewing a young lawyer, very articulate lawyer yesterday, and she said, I said, there is a wall in front of you and you are trying to beat it, break it, crack it, do something. How do you, what gets you out of home every morning? Why do you do this work? And she said, if not we, then who? We are the last one standing. So the quest for justice of 84 is actually a quest for this nation to amend its ways, to not target minorities for just votes and elections, because Congress won a massive landslide victory after this. And there is evidence of posters put around Delhi, labeling Sikhs as, I don't even use the word any longer, because I think, when a group of people, small or big, when they take to violence, they are not doing it only to create terror in the world. They're doing it because every other means has almost exhausted. They are separatists, they're militants, they're whatever. We are seeing this understanding now with the Hamas and the Israel war, that is going on. So all I'm saying is that three parts, again, to just conclude mine, is that we need to have a more nuanced view of where violence happened, where it did not happen. Because where it did not happen, where citizens prevented, and even where it happened, many citizens prevented it from everybody else getting butchered. Second aspect is that we should, what was my point? The third aspect is tenacity. That it shows something about the community. It shows resilience. It shows, and that comes from the faith in what the Constitution should be doing and has not done until. On urban and rural, in Punjab, the state-sponsored violence, I liked how Shruti, decade of disappearance, because otherwise it was a decade and a half of darkness. Because the violence in Punjab goes back to an incident in 1978, and it sort of ends by 1993, but of course it finally ends in 1995. But disappearances, yes, they started after Operation Blue Star, Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, the anti-Sikh pogrom, carnage, massacre, genocide. The violence was more in the villages, definitely. Cities were, I'm not saying that all cities had no violence at all, but it was mostly in villages. And the villages were also not too far from the cities. It's not like a very big state. It's not like America. It's like you are like 3 miles from the city. You're 5 miles from the city. So it's just that much. But yeah, the violence was more in the rural space.
Can I ask you to sort of explain a few things? I think words that were used between Shruti and Amandeep, like what disappearances are, what Godra is, and who the BJP is, and then partition, like one-liners about all of these. So I'll remind you what those are, because I don't think everybody knows these references. So starting with the disappearances, Godra, partition, BJP, oh yeah, and the farmers' protest. I'll remind you, whoever wants to take that. I'll be striking things off as you mention them.
I have a sore throat, Shruti. Please go on. Yeah.
You want me to? I'll try. These are like, you want us to describe this in like one
Just
line?
one-liners about what they are. Disappearance.
Okay.
Like, yeah,
Okay.
just one-liners.
I'll try. I'll try. So the disappearances refer mostly to, so these were state initiated, state sponsored. So you've probably, like, the audience here is probably familiar with the disappeared in the South American context, like in the Argentinian context or in other contexts, right? Where these were people who would disappeared. So, like I wrote a paper recently where I talk of them as being in between life and death, right? Because there is some sort of conviction that they are dead, but for many of them there isn't evidence. So for example, their bodies were not returned to their families and friends. There was a Sikh activist in Punjab, Jaswant Singh Khalada, who the Sikh diasporic community talks about a lot in California. They recently inaugurated a park after his name. He did a lot of work on the disappeared, and he found out about a lot of cremations that had happened, but these were not really reported by the state. So these were mostly young Sikh men who were disappeared by the Indian state, or they went missing, they were abducted, extrajudicial killings. And this was, again, it was a way to retaliate against the community. It was a way to target the community, following a succession of events that started much before 1984 and that continued after 1984. So for example, when I write about 1984 now, when I first started writing, I used to refer to 1984 only as June and November, but now I just use it as shorthand for things that started much before and then continued much after. And just because the decade of disappearances, so-called, ended in 1995, apparently, these things, trauma and violent events like this have these, like this continuous, they have a life after life, right? Like with the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's just never ending. It just crops up every few months, every few years, it just crops up. And we see this even with 1984. So even though, so does that, do you want me to say anything? So does that sort of gives you
that does it. And I think that what you're also saying with the disappearances, the young men,
exactly, mostly men, and it's also the visibility of Sikh identity, right? So how do they, because there are no visible sort of phenotypical differences between groups, and most groups, and there are differences between some, but most groups are not. So then the visible, the turban, the beard, those became markers, right? And those were the bodies that were targeted. So women were targeted too. And there's a book that a Sikh American a lawyer academic came out with 2 years ago, where she talks about gender and how gender is sort of this, there is this story of 1984 that's not told, and then there are many stories within stories, right, that are still kind of untold. So there is a gendered story that is not covered as much, but she writes about it. If people are interested, I can share the reference. So that's disappearances. The BJP is the current ruling party in India. They have a Hindu supremacist regime. There are similarities. So when the Sikhs were targeted in 1984, and then before 1984, when there were tensions between Sikhs and the Indian state, the Congress was in power. The Congress had played a really important part in the independence struggle against the British colonial rule. But the Congress was also, complicit in, when the partition of the Indian subcontinent happened in 1947. The partition refers to the division of the subcontinent that happened in 1947 that accompanied the end of British colonial rule. For the longest time in India, in Pakistan, there used to be only conversation and talk about how we triumphed over British colonial rule and gained independence. There wasn't as much discussion of the violence and the loss of lives, and again, gendered violence, etc., that happened. Of course, the massive exodus of people from what became Pakistan, later Bangladesh, to India, and in the other direction as well. So the partition, so the Congress party had played a part, and the Congress party was in power for many years, and I'm sure Amandeep can say more about this. But the one similarity between, often these parties will pit minority groups against each other. And the Congress will say, but we have a secular agenda. And the BJP is accused of, having the Hindu nationalist agenda and targeting Muslims. But actually, in some ways, there are also similarities. And one of them, I think one tension that exists, and that's, also a point of commonality between both parties and minority groups in India, is that they want centralization of power. They don't want to give a lot of minority groups or ethnic groups autonomy. So one big issue for Sikhs before 1984 was they just wanted more autonomy over state affairs, which the government at that time, led by Congress, was quick to dismiss as, oh, this is a demand for a separate state, it's a demand for secessionism, etc. And there are more complicated layers to that discussion, because there is a history of, sovereignty, within the Sikh faith. I'm not going to go into that. But the BJP is the current party. The Congress was the party in power when Sikhs were targeted. There are some differences between these parties. Now the left also tends to want to gravitate towards the Congress and sort of, elevate them as heroes. But when it really comes to targeting minorities, I think all political parties that have been in power, are in power, have targeted minorities in various ways. There are similarities and differences. It might also be about like the Hindu, the BJP has a very explicit Hindu supremacist agenda and makes no bones about this. I was reading just like a few days ago about how the media, which is again, so shaped by the BJP, has managed to, the Indian media, not all of them, but mainstream Indian media has managed to embed itself into the Israeli army. So typically, as a post-colonial context, and that's how I grew up in India for the first 25 years of my life. And it was a very different kind of power dynamic where India was part of the non-aligned movement. India was part of, where we would, support countries like Palestine or, those were the countries, right? But now it's really shifted. So it just says in terms of global and transnational political dynamic, it says a lot about how they are reporting, they are telling the story of the Israeli state, and it's not, and Israel is a nuanced, again, context as well, right? But it just to give you an example of the kind of regime and the sort of reporting that gets covered now. Then what was the other thing? So I covered partition, disappearances, BJP, Congress.
Godhra was in 2002. It was pogrom against Muslims, yes. Primarily in the state of Gujarat, and there are also several films actually on Godhra as well. And the farmers' protest, which ended in November of 2021, was going on for a year and a half, I would say, starting first in Punjab and against the three laws that the government tried to impose on them, which essentially, and Amandeep and Shruti can fill in the gaps, essentially corporatization of farmers. And that's really interesting because there's a film that is in the making on American farmers called Deja Vu. And I don't know when it's going to be made, but there's a trailer on on YouTube that you may want to go and take a look. Essentially, what the filmmaker is arguing is that corporatization has already happened in America, and that's what the farmers in primarily the protesters are primarily Sikhs and Punjabis were like against.
I've seen the rough cut of Payne's film. So Vedbhadra is basically going around the American villages and farms and talking to people, and they are saying that in the Reagan era, liberalization happened in the farming sector in America, and they didn't understand it. They fell for it, and they're very appreciative. It was shot during the farmers' protest, and they're very appreciative of how these farmers in North India understood the design and they are protesting against. That film is basically about that. Yeah.
Right, and there was a petition that was signed by the American farmers when the farmers in India were protesting. So while we're talking about something so specific in India, it has a much more global context to various things that we're noting, I think, which I think is interesting and important to kind of take note of. And what you're saying, Shruti, about the difference between Congress and BJP, of course, what is playing in my head is the difference between Republicans and Democrats. While there are subtle differences, but essentially they're both representing the nation, and what that means in representing the nation and the location of the people in the society who are in the disadvantaged groups like women or racial minorities, LGBTQ, etc. Of course, it will, in the end, I'm simplifying it, in the interest of time, will mean the same thing, because they're both representing the Native Americans, the essentially representing the nation. So one is soft and one is hard.
Exactly. I think there are parallels, absolutely. And just like any society is stratified and has its issues, right? Like in this society tends mostly to be, it's of course an intersectional identity, which your students I'm sure are familiar with, right? Like we all have intersectional identities. So it's not just race, but how it intersects with gender, with class, sexuality, disability, etc. In India, religion tends to be sort of an important axis, right? But then it intersects with other things that we've talked about. Caste is something that is not discussed as much in this context, even though there is some discussion now. So California was slated to be the first state to ban caste, and I think now there's some controversy about that happening or going through with that. But Sikhs were sort of part of those discussions as well, young Sikh Americans, and I guess we'll talk about the second generation a little bit more. But there are definitely, you're right, there are parallels between India and the US or any other society as well, right? Like the ways in which they're divided and stratified.
Right. I mean, yeah, there's so much that you have said. And coming back to the issue of the Sikhs again, and the disappearances, that's where we sort of veered off. It shows up in my interviews with the Sikhs, and the reason I raised the rural-urban question is because of what I noted in the interviews myself. And I call them boys because that's sort of the Indian thing to say instead of young men. Families sent their boys abroad for fear of being harassed and persecuted and disappeared, by the state. So I want to
just nuance it a little more. I mean, like just to elaborate on that point of who went abroad. So there were people who were, I mean, the police came down hard on them, because as Shruti mentioned that there were disappearances, young boys were being picked up, and most of them are from a particular caste background and religion as well, but actually the work of a group called ensaf.org or of Sarpreet, they actually show that they were even from other castes, and even from some of the ones picked up were Hindu boys. So it was not only Sikhs. And then there were also women picked up. So the data is quite interesting. It is online. It's available. You can look at it. That list is still being made. I mean, so the families of those who were picked up, they were tortured. But typically what would happen is that in the Punjab, in the farms of Punjab, many people live in a solo house in the middle of their farm. So this is where the militants would come and hide in the night, and many a times forcefully hide, ask for food. So these people would be compelled to give them, shelter. And next day morning, the police would come and say, "Oh, you are with the militants. You are harboring militants." Now, I mean, it was not their fault that militants came and stayed with them, and that's just the way they live. So many of these families. Then there were those who, and they basically came to America and to Canada on political asylum. That our life is at threat in India, in Punjab. Then there were those who families willfully sent abroad, the young ones, like Dinti is talking about. And now more and more research is coming up, and even some of the militants were rehabilitated, who surrendered, were rehabilitated by the state abroad. given completely new identities, completely new documentation, and sent abroad. So there are various kinds of people who have come through the channels which are available. And of course, now migration is a very, very big theme in Punjab, because the exodus. And that is another thing we need to notice about 1984, that at the time of 1984, Punjab was the breadbasket of the country. Tiny little, less than 2% land was actually feeding 60-70% of the country, because India was a poor country. There was rain-fed agriculture, but Punjab became a grain powerhouse. So that was one aspect of Punjab, and that put Punjab on the top of the Indian states, and it stayed there for decades. But after 84, and then the decade of disappearances, as Shruti said, on the basis of that document that they said, and it was not only power to them more in their state, but they said it was basically an argument between centralization and federalism. How much power, like you live in America, your states are so independent. You were the model for this kind of an argument. Now, the other model was the Russian model, where everything is centralized by the state, which is how India wanted to be. But these guys were saying that why don't states have more powers? Why can't we decide on things on our own? Which was unfairly, completely declared as a secessionist document. And now, if you look at it, the current Congress leadership is talking about greater federalism, because now we are under this, very nationalist government, who is, many are very troubled by it. So now they are saying, oh, we should have great federalism. But you had the chance then, and you didn't take it. So this kind of understanding, many things that Punjab was saying at that point were actually good for the whole country if the country had adopted it. But like my book, when I did it a few years back, 25 years after militancy, I visited the state to see, has peace returned? The guns have silenced, but has peace returned here? And I realized that no, there is huge discontent. Because if the earlier call for greater federalism was based on 3, 4, 5 issues, now there are 10 issues. So the sad experience of Punjab, of course, the Sikhs and the events of 84, is that all of it has actually been, I'm very sad to say, but it has not given the people anything. None of the issues have been solved for Punjab. In fact, now there are more issues overlaying the previous ones. So that is what 84 has done to us. And Punjab has slipped somewhere to the middle in our development indices. Everybody wants to escape Punjab today, whoever gets a chance. So this is, to me, structural violence by a state on a region of the state. So what the community is best known for in India is, of course, farmers, soldiers. And I'm adding a new one to it, which is actually true. I'm just finding it out, is transporters. Because when India became independent, it is these guys who took trucks everywhere with material on them. So what does a new country need? It needs cement to build houses. It needs food grains to eat. It needs wood for fires. It needs, all that. So these transporters from Punjab were going all over the country ferrying stuff and stitching India together. And then now agriculture has become unprofitable. People are quitting the country instead of going into soldiery. And transportation also has been taken over by the big companies. So the traditional jobs of these people are completely at risk today. And this is structural violence. The 84 for me is also how violence is executed on a region and then just devastated.
Right. So I'm going to move us along a little bit, and because I do have some questions and follow-ups for what you said, Amandeep, but I'll reserve it for the end. I'm watching time. I want to move on to talking about some of the macro memorialization questions. So in light of all of this that we've said today, what is the importance of memorializing And is there any difference in this memorializing between in India and the diaspora? And then, I have more follow-ups on that as well. So we can sort of start that.
You're following a sort of pattern, Shruti. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Sure. Yeah. I think, and Amandeep can correct me if I'm wrong, because my study has been focused on talking to Sikhs in the diaspora. So I've been doing it for a while, and so what I know about India is just based on just some secondary sources that I've read or what people tell me from what they know. So I can't talk about the India piece as much. I can talk about the diaspora. I think there are, the 1984 is a really important way to construct and make sense of what it means to be Sikh in the diaspora, or just, what it means to be Sikh, broadly speaking. There are many different ways in which we could interpret why Sikhs are remembering 1984, and it's an intergenerational cohort of Sikhs who are remembering 1984, and I write about this in my work. So the first generation are defined as, of course, first generation, both in terms of, how scholars of immigration understand first generation, which is, the generation that directly migrates from, countries of origin, or host or home countries, whatever you might want to call it. And then I also refer to the first generation as people who either actually survived the violence themselves, so they went through the violence, they are survivors, and then they migrated after that, or they witnessed it in some ways, directly, indirectly, they witnessed it, and they were in India, but some of them were already in the diaspora. So all of them together, I refer to them as the first generation Sikh diasporic, people who are doing the work of memory. And then second generation is mostly descendants or children of these first generation migrants, right? Both those who suffered, witnessed, were already in the diaspora. And what's interesting is that it's not just the children whose families, have members who suffered the violence, which is a lot, and not all the families, but it is a lot of family members in direct or indirect ways had suffered the violence. But even people without any direct familial or kinship connection with the violence of 1984 remember it today. So it's an intergenerational cohort, and one reason for it is, of course, it's a way to kind of construct identity, it's a way to perform identity, it's a way to make sense of what it means to be Sikh in the diaspora. But also, very importantly, it's a way to contest the dominant Indian state narrative that we started with, right? Because the Indian state narrative has a very narrow and self-celebratory story of 1984, right? That we are the good guys, right? Just like with any other conflict, right? Or any other kind of power dynamic, the Indian state, everyone who was involved in, 1984, the state, they were the good guys, and the Sikhs and everyone else who was supporting Sikhs, like Amandeep reminded us, it was tainted with a religious brush, and there was a religious aspect to it, to the extent that the Indian state at the time assumed Hindu identity, and that has been a concern since partition. And like I said, Congress would like to portray itself as secular, but is it really? And 1984 is a very blatant example of how, it's not really as secular as they would like themselves to, portray. But anyway, the Indian state sort of has portrayed itself as the good guys, and the Sikhs are the bad people, and they've always justified the violence, right? And they've said that, oh, we attacked the Golden Temple because we needed to flush out terrorists who were in the temple at the time. So we're sorry if there was collateral damage, or they don't even say we are sorry, right? I'm just like, I'm being a little bit facetious. I shouldn't, but they just say that we attacked the shrine because there were terrorists in the shrine, and we needed to flush them out. So they justify the violence, they rationalize the violence of June. And then in November, they say it was because, it was because the Sikh bodyguards, Prime Minister's bodyguards assassinated her, so we justified. So the Indian state has a story, and when Sikhs in the diaspora remember 1984, and they do it through various ways, right? They do it in their gurdwaras, they'll do it in family spaces, they do it a lot in and through digital media, which is, my focus in my research. They're really talking back to the dominant story of the Indian state and saying, listen, there is an entire kind of, there's an entire set of voices that has not been recorded so far. And we need to tell our story and we need to assert ourselves. So it's a way to resist, right? And it's a way to reclaim the story or the experience of 1984 as experienced by the community, right? So it's a lot of loss, it's a lot of suffering, and they're really just trying to take back that narrative, which the Indian state never takes into account, right? Or hardly ever. There is some shift. I feel like some of what's happening in India, and again, Amandeep can say more about this, I feel like some of the shift in the memory of 1984 and why 1984 is talked about a little bit more in India today is precisely because of these transnational flows and diasporic flows. I think a lot of this work was first done or is being done in the diaspora. One reason being precisely because they are, because they have the safety of this space, right? Like we are having this conversation here and it's still a virtual space, but just the fact that we can have this conversation or they can have these conversations in community spaces, they will still get attacked, right? There was an assassination of a Sikh leader that happened, just a couple of months ago. They will still get attacked, but it's still relative safety. And yet there is an emotional proximity because there has always been a robust Sikh diaspora. Like one of the first groups of South Asians to migrate from South Asia were Sikhs. So there has always been that robust diaspora and transnational connections with the home. The definition has changed. It used to be India more broadly. After 1984, it became much more narrow and it's Punjab. But it's so why they remember is, because it's a way to talk back. It's a way to maintain these transnational connections. It's also a way for these generations to kind of, it's a way for the older generation to transmit some of these stories to the younger generation. So family members might not always talk about this because these are very difficult experiences to talk about, but there might be other members of the community that are talking about it in Sikh places of worship or gurdwaras. And so that's how second generation Sikhs first find out about it. And then later, like this came up in some of my interviews, they later discovered that, oh, we also have a familial connection with this. So there are a lot of different layers. And then it gets, sometimes it also intersects with their position of racial and religious marginalization in the US. But I can talk a little bit more about that later. And they don't talk about it very explicitly in their interviews, at least they didn't with me, but I can extrapolate a little bit based on what they've told me. So those are some of the things I think that I'll talk about, and then Amandeep can add more.
No, I'll just like to add a small thing that Shruti earlier mentioned. You remember that in California, there was about to pass a bill against casteism. So I live in South India, and caste is big in South India, and who are the guys who are migrating from here? It's mostly software engineers. It's the white collar jobs. And now in the last few years, you see how in various software companies, caste is becoming, a thing. I mean, the reason California is because it is where the Silicon Valley is, For whatever reason, they didn't pass the bill. But now the Sikh migrants were going from Punjab. It's because when people move, they're just not bodies moving, right? Their memory is moving, their culture moving, there's food moving, there's all sorts of things moving with them. And if your experience in India has been negative, that you are basically fleeing the country, then you are taking that idea of India with you. It might be your idea of it, but it is an idea. And your idea of India is that it's a brutal, repressive state. It killed my brother, it killed my son, it killed my, whatever. And like with partition of India, for decades, people did not speak about it in their families. Dominantly, I mean, some families they spoke. Nothing is absolute in whatever I'm saying. But similar for the 80s. You don't want to start telling your children that, this happened. I mean, you don't know how old the child should be when the child can receive. But in the meantime, the child is already receiving it from the gurdwaras or from neighbors or from peer groups and all that. So this is what is like academicians have defined it as intergenerational trauma. And they grew up with it, thinking that India is this brutal country. That's their reality. You can't. So the only way to amend both Indian Sikhs asking for justice or the diaspora making it into an issue which is now being again and again. And one thing I would just add is that the idea of a separate state of Khalistan, of course, it was dominant in the 80s and until the mid 90s, and then it sort of stayed on till about 2010, 2005 or so, for another decade. But then it ebbed. I mean, that's the embers are there, the embers of memory are there. But look at how during the farmers' protest and before that, a new political party was emerging in India, in Punjab. And they went around collecting money from the entire diaspora. For what? To fight your elections. But why would the diaspora give you that money? Because they want something in return. And their idea of what they wanted, it was never discussed. It was never like publicly, okay, this trade-off will happen. Was that they somehow wanted a different rule in Punjab, which many of them interpreted as Khalistan. Anyway, that party lost. It has won now. Now they have the government in Punjab. And then during the farmers' protest, an entire lot of corporate media, basically corporate media, I'm saying the ones backed by big corporations, who would be served by the farmers' protest, they just started saying these guys are separatists, they're anti-national, they're Khalistanis. And that had to be then challenged. And all the work that Shruti is doing on visual media is, to some extent, it comes from the farmers' protest as well, because I was talking to another person today because I'm going down interviewing. So she was saying that most protests worldwide are becoming protests of narratives. There is a state narrative, and then there are those opposing that narrative, they have their own narrative. So it's like one narrative pitched against another. Now, then you take strategically positions on whether to actually contradict what somebody is throwing or to shift the game to yourself and say, this is what we are saying. That is what the farmers' protest did. And I personally feel, I've seen it in my lifetime. In 84, Punjab lost its narrative. Everybody started calling them terrorists and this and that. But it's in 21 when they won the farmers' protest, they sort of regained their narrative. So that was an important step for me. And similarly, the diaspora has its, there are referendums going on. They're not legally tenable referendums, but they're going on, and there are some numbers of people coming for it. Now, that number is a fraction of what the Sikhs are in those countries, but still it shows you, these are indicators of things. So all these things come together.
Yeah, and I think that as you were talking, and especially as somebody who's interested in issues of migration and how identities migrate, and what the question that always, well, not always, but that came to me as you were talking, Amandeep, is how if the people who are the privileged castes who are leaving, and coming into the Silicon Valley in the US, and how the Hindu supremacist identity is being carried over, and what does that mean for, because in the US we say Indian, right? And I think that categorization itself is very, very problematic because of all these fissures that are inside of it. And in the US and probably in the West, by way of that, Indian equates Hindu, right? And there's a historical reason for that. While India has, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, etc. So how that gradual strengthening and of the right-wing Hindu groups is impacting the memorialization and community formation in the United States and the diaspora in general is a question that I have, and I don't know if that probably cannot be answered today, but because we in the US don't exist in a vacuum, we exist in a world, and how the world kind of comes in and we go out, and its impact on this memorialization is of interest to me, as Shruti sort of mentioned, how the racial marginalization of Sikhs as non-whites, also may have an impact on this memorialization. So hold on to your thoughts, Shruti. At this point, what I think might be useful is, because we're sort of towards the end, and I want to open up to people and see if they have questions, and then we can come back to Shruti and Amandeep, which might be a good way to get people's thoughts on this. Questions you have, comments you have, what's going through your heads as you're listening to this. How are you processing this?
So folks, I think we have enabled the Q&A. So on your screens, if you're on a laptop at the bottom, you can type your question into the Q&A, and that way we'll be able to answer everything in order. And yeah, we thank you for all of our presenters. This is an amazing opportunity for those of us really unfamiliar with this part of Indian history to have a nice deep understanding of the nuances as you all have pointed out. So thank you very much.
Sarmeet has a question. Sarmeet, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Diditi. Yeah, so I have more a comment than a question. As you might be able to tell from my beard and turban, I am a Sikh. In fact, I've had lots of interactions with Diditi in the past, where she has interviewed me and my wife for some of the work that she's been doing. And I wanted to just relate a little bit of my own experience first. I mean, when the 1984 incidents happened, I was already in the US. So my immediate family was not directly impacted, though, of course, it was very traumatic to see what was going on with my community and with my relatives as well, who were still in India. In fact, my brother-in-law, who was in Delhi at that time, was a pharmacist, and his shop was looted and burnt in those riots. And as a result of that, he ended up migrating to the US. So he's an example of a victim that moved and left the country as a result of what happened. But, more than that, I just want to say that it's very, very heartening, first of all, to see people that are not Sikh, like Diditi, like Shruti, to have done a research on this and to be able to come up with what I would say more unbiased views of what happened. A lot of time when I speak to people, when I talk to them, there's always this idea that I'm talking about it from a Sikh viewpoint, and therefore it's received with a certain amount of tentativeness. But to hear people that are not part of the community to have done the research and then be able to present this material in a non-biased way is really very heartening and very redeeming, and really good to see. So I'm really very appreciative of that. And Amandeep, who I believe is part of my community, clearly has done an incredible job in terms of his own research and his own writings. And it's really wonderful to see all of that work going on. So I just wanted to put that out there. I mean, it's been really good for me personally to have listened to this. And of course, it brings back lots of memories, but it also gives me a hope that there is some possibility for justice in the future as we continue to look at these things and not let them pass into our memories. We try to keep them alive so that things like this will not happen in the future. And I'm open to any other questions that anybody else might want to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarmeet, and thank you for showing up on this very last minute. Thank you so much. Anybody else has any thoughts, comments?
There is a question in the Q&A, Diditi. Can you see that question?
No, I cannot.
No? Would you like me to read off the question? And this is from Jocelyn. What stuck out to me was the assassination of Indira Gandhi. What was the reason behind her bodyguards murdering her? Who exactly is Indira Gandhi, what was her role? Thank you.
That's a good question, Jocelyn. Who, either Shruti or Amandeep?
Sure. I mean, I can get us started if that's okay. So the head of state, India is a parliamentary system following the British colonizers. So the head of the state in India is the prime minister, just like the head of the state in the US is the president. The head of the state is the prime minister. There is a president in India, but they only have nominal power. So it's just like, something that you just want to get signed off, sort of like, so it's not, they don't really have real decision-making powers. So just like the decision-making powers here lie with the president and their cabinet, in India, it's the prime minister and their cabinet. Indira Gandhi is this really very complex, leader, charismatic but complex. A lot of problems actually that exist in India today can be traced back to Indira Gandhi's leadership and her position as a prime minister. Indira Gandhi's father was the first prime minister of independent India. And in many ways, it's sort of like, it's also a case of nepotism. So it's dynastic politics, so her father was the prime minister. She became prime minister. Her sons, one of her sons, became prime minister after she was assassinated. But she had a lot of power, and so there were a lot of tensions between the Indian state and Sikh community before all of this violence started unfolding and culminated and then carried on in and after 1984. But she was the head of state. She was the prime minister when the Sikh shrine in Amritsar, Punjab, that we mentioned before, the Golden Temple, was invaded in June 1984. She was the prime minister. They could very well have avoided that invasion. There have been a lot of people, academics, journalists, specialists who've written about how it was a completely avoidable step, and it was quite deliberate in some ways, very intentional on her part to do that. So there was a lot of anger against the Indian state, but especially directed towards her, right? And so when you get really angry at someone, you want to try and retaliate in some way. And so her bodyguards targeted her, and assassinated her. It was out of a deep sense of outrage and loss and anger, right? Like, what do you do when you're so frustrated, as a marginalized, like as a person of color? There are so many ways in which I keep hitting walls in this context. And in sociology courses, if you've taken some with Professor Mitra, I'm sure you've come across this. But, you just get so frustrated with the system when it's pitted against you. And so sometimes this is how you retaliate, right? And that's why the assassination happened. But she played a very important, she played a very strategic role, important role in, inflicting a lot of these, inflicting a lot of this violence, but just also inflicting a lot of other problems on the Sikh community. And so this was sort of like the last straw. We've had enough. And so her bodyguards assassinated her. I think that kind of maybe answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the question too. Yeah.
Thank you, Yasin, for showing up. Yeah, she's in my class. So thank you for showing up on this Friday morning. So if you could also, Amandeep or Shruti, give a history to that anger. Like, history didn't begin on October 31, clearly, right? Or with Operation Blue Star, which was the June 6th invasion of the Golden Temple of that year. So just a little bit of context to that anger. Either one of you.
Amandeep, maybe do you want to say something?
I think it's enough for one morning. I mean, there is a lot of history and there is always history. But if you want to, we spoke about it earlier, I think, very, very briefly. Notice the year 1984, notice the year 1947. There are only 37 years of difference between them. India was a very young country in 1984. Democracy itself was a very, very new concept for India. Now, we were largely run by kings and then by an empire. And it's a very diverse country. It has many languages, many kinds of ethnicities, perhaps the most diverse country in the world. Now, here is this region called Punjab in the north of India, where at one point, just about 100 years before 1947, there was a kingdom by a king, which was supposed to be a just kingdom, where people were happy. Now, nobody's ever happy. Not all people are ever happy, but it's generally considered. The religion itself the Sikh religion itself is about 550 years old. So now at 400 years of it, there was a kingdom, which finally the British annexed. And then 100 years of colonization happens, and then 1947 happens. In 1947, when it happens, of course, Punjab is partitioned, as is the east of India, Bengal, another region, huge region, was a partition. Now, there are these people from this region who have historical memory of having had a different kind of a system which worked for them. And now they are in a democracy, just a new democracy, which has already failed once because there have been countrywide protests against it just a few years before 1984. So the disenchantment with what democracy can give to people was very high. And the historical memory of how we were in different system better off was there. So that is the reason on which this whole thing is built up. When partition was happening also, the Sikhs had a choice because they were from a different religion, whether we should stay with India or Pakistan or go have another country of our own. And in whatever wisdom they decided, no, we'll throw our lot with India. And now you've come to India, I've already mentioned, you're feeding the whole country. And then you're seeing that the regime is not treating you well. So those are the kind of reasons which created an unrest in Punjab even then. And then there was further factionalism within Punjab. There's a question of the resource of water, like how would water be divided between states? And that triggered sort of the protests against. And of course, after that, it's huge history. But the background to what happened in 84 lies in this water division, lies before that in the whole country protesting against the government, lies in the declaration that Shruti talked about, that we actually don't need to have a centralized democracy for a diverse country. Make it more equitable for everybody to live here. And before that, it lies in partition, that we made a mistake maybe coming with India. There's that kind of history.
Janice,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat, and I saw there were actually two questions in the chat, and I saw that you replied directly to.
Finally figured out how to get.
Yeah, you replied directly to one question, but I think that reply goes only to that participant. It doesn't go to everyone. So anyway, and I see Lucy has her hand up as well. So from the chat, and I guess this is open to any of our presenters. Could you elaborate on the idea of constructing identity in the context of the diaspora, particularly younger generations? How does memorializing affects or benefits this identity forming?
I think that's Shruti's area.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that question. It's a good question. It's a very broad question. But I guess so it's building, constructing identity. So I think for the younger generations, there's the Sikh diaspora has I think like I said earlier, they're among the first South Asian groups to have started migrating to the US, other parts of North America, but other parts of the world as well, because of the history of colonization, the way in which the British constructed various groups in India. So the Sikhs were part of the army that migrated, or part of the colonial armies that the British had across the world, but also did labor in many ways, etc. So they have a long history. But now, like, if you were to think, there are at least 2 or 3 succeeding generations of younger Sikhs in the diaspora. When I look at it from the because my focus is on 1984. Why is 1984 such an important way to understand or construct Sikh identity. It's memory, just broadly speaking, is important in the Sikh community. When Sikhs remember the past, 1984 is actually one of the contemporary events that they remember. But when they remember the past, they go back much longer back into the past, from the very founding of the faith to other events that happened in the Sikh history. So as a person of color, let's say as a person of color, right, a second or succeeding generation of migrant, if you're growing up in a diasporic context like the US, you're living in a society where the mainstream society is, you're excluded from it in many ways. You're part of it, of course, right, as an American, in other ways you're part of this society, but you're also excluded from this society. You're also on the margins in many ways. And so you try and connect, at least, as you grow older, that's what sociologists and other social scientists find, that as young people grow older, by the time they reach late adolescence, etc., they become more curious about their identity. And that might be true of people at large. It's not necessarily true of just immigrants, but as you grow older, you might just become more curious about, okay, who are we? Where are we coming from? What's our community? What's our group, etc. And that also holds true for Sikhs. So when Sikhs start questioning their identity or looking back to understand where they come from, how they're connected with their faith, with their community, with, transnational contexts like India, Punjab, other things, 1984 plays a part. So you're trying to make sense, right? You have this sort of, you're trying to find an anchor. All of us are trying to make meaning in life in many different ways. And for some groups, that meaning making is more complex than others. And when I'm saying some groups, I'm talking about groups that are marginalized. So in the diaspora, it just becomes like these other layers of exclusion and other layers of reflection and exclusion that then you try and reflect on. And 1984 is one piece. It's one way in which to understand, okay, this happened with my community. And because it's more contemporary, you can go back in time and challenge, what at the time used to be the oppressive, what were constructed at least as the oppressive Mughal rulers. You can do that, but you can still question the Indian state, right? So a lot of it also becomes like constructivist kind of thing. So I shared this paper on disappearances. This is like the organization that Amandeep had mentioned, INSAF, which is a group of second generation Sikh Americans who started this organization, but are working with community members and other non-Sikhs in India, especially in Punjab, to document disappearances. This is an example of the kind of identity work, right, that they're doing. They're trying to make sense of who they are, and they're trying to do something in more sort of concrete, proactive ways. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Lucy, what's your question?
I think you mute.
Sorry, I know we have very little time. I just want to ask, because we're talking about Sikh people, and I know maybe not everybody know what is the Sikh religion, what is the main idea behind that. And like, we know they wear turban, they have beard, but I remember I was at event when we had like multi-religious event, and there were certain things I noticed. This religion was very peaceful, very accepting, like women and men are treated the same way. The name is the same. So can you please tell more about it? Because that may help. Thank you.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes tops.
I think Lucy said it. I mean, like, for a talk like this, I think Lucy actually explained the religion. I thank you, Lucy. And I mean, I'll just add to that. It's like, yeah, they're peaceful, but if they are pushed to a point, then they retaliate very badly. And what we are talking about is the retaliation.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you. So I know that Simar is here. He's Sikh himself. Do you want to add anything to it, our student? Because I have some, international student as well and regular student.
We are like always ready to serve, like giving, like we call it langar. And like in our country, even at Golden Temple, the place that was attacked, like you have 24/7 langar available. Like anyone from any religion can go there, have food and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are much bigger than this, but like it takes time to like understand.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that I mean I go to the gurdwaras and it's like it's one place where I can safely criticize Modi and nobody will get upset. And I enjoy that. I love that. You know, I don't go to mandirs. I'm not a believer, but also mandirs generate money to support the Hindu right-wing government in India. One can safely say that, you know, of any Hindu temples in the United States. So that's the other reason why, you know, I hesitate to go, you know, because I don't believe. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I said this earlier on, but one other thing that I would just like to highlight is the spiritual and the political go hand in hand. And the West, of course, wants to make this distinction, right? And so then it just conflicts. Also, the Indian state wants to make this distinction. So, for example, like there are the 5 symbols associated with Sikh identity. And again, these were symbols that evolved over time, and not everyone wears these symbols, all 5 symbols as a set. Not everyone wears them. But for example, one way in which one sociologist offers an interpretation of these symbols is there is the dagger or the sword or the kirpan that Sikhs carry, and then there is also the kara, right, which is the steel bangle that they wear. So the bangle is supposed to restrain you from inflicting violence unless and until it gets to a point where you cannot, like, it's just so much injustice, right? Like even post-colonial thinkers like Fanon, for example, write about how you need to resort to violence eventually sometimes, right, when no other resort is left. So in that sense, you know, the bangle holds you back, but the sword, if I need to protect my community or I need to protect someone else, right, which is also how the Hindu community has constructed Sikhs traditionally as this martial arm of the Hindu community, right? So if you need to protect someone, you will inflict violence, but it's very difficult for someone who has a narrow view or wants to develop a narrow view, see how those can go hand in hand, and they do. And there is, and it just creates for richness and a more sort of, you know, larger way of looking at things. And Simarjeet, right, was right, like seva or altruistic service is such an important aspect of being Sikh as well, right? Like seva, altruistic service for the sake of service. You know, Sarbat Pala, which is, you know, thinking about everyone in humanity, not just the community. So a lot of very interesting, complex values that go with being Sikh. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
If I can add, can I just add one quick thing?
Sure.
I just wanted to also mention that the history of Sikhs is a history of persecution and defending against that persecution. So this is why the, you know, so-called ability to defend and the kirpan, and they are so much part of the religion, is because all through history, they had to defend themselves against the Mughal rulers who wanted to eliminate them completely because of the stand that they took against them. So our history is absolutely full of resisting violence and resisting the desire for someone to completely eliminate a community. Just wanted to add that.
So I think we have run out of time, and there are so many things that we could keep talking about. But I'd like to thank our presenters for making time, and for Amandeep, I think it's like 10 p.m. or something. Yes. And thank you again to GCP, Sociology Department, and International Center for supporting this, students for showing up. And it's a conversation that we will keep having. So thank you so much.
I just want to add really quickly, our dean, Nora Kerr-McCurry, had to leave early to go to another meeting, and she had felt bad that she had to leave. So she said, tell them personally that I said thank you. So I told her that I would do that. So she says thank you.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you.